This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Institute of Historical Research, University of London. Thank you all for coming to join in the conference today and the launch at the end of the day. It's a great pleasure to see you all here. We're going to be in the beverage hall for most of the day, and then we'll walk over to the launch pad, which is the Macmillan Hall. And some of you may think going from Beveridge to Macmillan is a curiously apt way of celebrating a project looking at the history of the teaching of history in this country. Although, of course, the Macmillan we're going to is not the first Earl of Stockton, but Baron Hugh Macmillan of Aberfeldy, who was the Minister of Information at the beginning of the Second World War and made propaganda the familiar term that it's become today. I hope there's no lesson in looking at school curriculum to be found there. Anyway, we're delighted at the Institute to have hosted the History of Education project for the last 2.5 years, and we're very proud and pleased to have done so for two main reasons. First of all, ever since it was established in 1921, the Institute of Historical Research has not only been interested in advanced historical research, but the curriculum at school and in the universities. And indeed, several of my distinguished predecessors as director are featured in the book that we're talking about today, and their contributions to the making of the curriculum are discussed. Nowadays, the Institute, along with the Royal Historical Society and the Historical Association, frequently takes part in discussions and advice and consultancy around matters to do with history and the representation of our discipline. And I have to say it's with great pleasure that the Secretary of State has hosted some of those occasions where we've discussed such things, and it's very nice to see him here today. The other reason we were very pleased to take on the project in 2008 was the team that were leading it. The co-authors, Nicola, Jenny and David, have done an absolutely wonderful job. You'll be hearing from all of them during the course of the day, and not only hearing them, but the publishers have asked me to remind you, we hope you'll be reading them as specially assigned homework when you go away. The book is being offered at a discounted price today, so we hope you'll all buy one and take it home. I've got some little housekeeping announcements. I'm going to make them before I introduce the speakers. I hope the speakers don't mind being segued between the grand opening and the toilets. But there we are. In case of fire, there will be an alarm. You must go quickly, and it says calmly here to the nearest exit, and there will be green signs indicating the quickest way out, and we gather in Mallet Street amongst the builders and road workers in the case of a fire. The restrooms are to the right as you go out of the door, and there is a disabled toilet in that direction as well. Having done the housekeeping, let me move to the far more pleasurable task which remains to me, which is to introduce our first speaker, who in the convention really needs no introduction, but he certainly deserves one. Professor Sir David Cannadine is one of the most foremost historians at work in the world today. His reputation rests on two main achievements, I think. First and foremost, as a scholar, he has pioneered the serious study of modern monarchy. He has reinvigorated the study of aristocracy. He has made us rethink concepts such as class and empire and philanthropy, and he's done all that whilst being a very dedicated and loyal servant of three universities, Cambridge, Columbia and Princeton. It's at Princeton that he's currently Dodge Professor of History, and of course taking on one of the most difficult jobs in the world, being Director of the Institute of Historical Research between 1998 and 2003. But David's reputation not only rests on that great wave of scholarship over many years, but also on his advocacy as a passionate and professional historian, in his own words, making history matter, making history happen, as a broadcaster, as an essayist, as an advisor, as a consultant and a trustee. It's hard to think of anyone who has done so much to keep the public engaged with history over the last 20 years or so. And that scholarship and that passion and commitment lie at the heart of this project and what he's brought to the book. And it's a really very great pleasure to introduce him as our first speaker this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Cannadine.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Miles, thank you for that immensely kind and generous and positively terrifying introduction. We have a lot of business to get through today, and I'm sure you're all eager as I am to listen to what the Secretary of State has to say, so I won't detain you very long. Can I begin with 3 quotations, if I may? Here's the first one. It is surprising to find how little real knowledge of history is possessed by the average Englishman, or even by the average educated Englishman. Here's the second quotation. There is a grave tendency among grown-up people to be shocked that children did not know all the history that grown-ups thought they ought to know. And here's the third one. We need to return to an old-fashioned method which had governed the teaching of history for generations, namely dates, conventional divisions, and an insistence upon mechanical accuracy. Do those ideas and those quotations sound familiar? Well, they might well, because they summarise so much of what is being said today about history in schools being in an almost terminal crisis of decline for some of the reasons that those quotations allude to. But you might be interested to know that the first of those quotations comes from 1906, the second of those quotations comes from 1916, and the third of those quotations comes from Hilaire Belloc in 1924. In other words, as those quotations suggest, complaining about the inadequacy of teaching history in English schools has been going on for as long as English history has been taught in English schools. It goes, as it were, with the territory. And that being so, we might want to ask ourselves why that is so. Should we believe what is said, and if not, then what ought we to be doing instead? When, for example, Jeremy Paxman deplores the fact that insufficient attention is being given in English schools to teaching the history of the British Empire, which means, of course, that his book is selling less well than he would ideally wish. He is also merely reproducing, but wholly unawares, a complaint that was made by, among others, Winston Churchill during the Second World War, by King George V in the 1920s, and by Lord Meath himself, the inventor of Empire Day, before 1914. In other words, I would like to begin by venturing the view that as long as history has been taught in English schools, it has always been a contentious and a controversial subject. People have disagreed over whether it's taught well or whether it's taught badly, or what indeed history being taught well or history being taught badly actually means. There's always been disagreement over whether history should be a cheerleading narrative of national greatness or a warts and all account of our island story. There's always been disagreement as to whether history teaching in schools should focus on the history of this nation or on the history of this nation in the context of a broader world. There's always been disagreement over whether history teaching should cover a long span of time or whether it should focus in more detail on a shorter span of time. There's always been disagreement over whether the teaching of history should be about kings and queens and battles and politicians, or whether it should be about the history of ordinary people. There's always been disagreement over whether history is about knowledge or whether, in fact, it's about skills. In other words, most of the disagreements today, which focus on many of those subjects, are in fact the latest iteration of a set of controversies which have been going on for as long as history has actually been taught in schools. And one of the many ironies that strikes me as an observer of this, the current discussions and debates, is that they're discussions and debates motivated by the belief that history is very important, and yet they're discussions and debates on the whole wholly devoid of any historical perspective. And it seems to me, if we have no historical perspective, if we have no sense of proportion in terms of the current debate, then we're probably not going to get clear in our own minds what, if anything, the current problem is, beyond merely a repetition of things that are constantly being repeated and have been repeated from the 1900s on. For example, a huge amount of the current debate and discussion begins and assumes that there was once a golden age when history was much better taught in the classroom than it is now, when every school child could recite the names and reigns of every British monarch from 1066 to the present day. And that from this golden age of historical knowledge, which was conveyed in schools, there has been a catastrophic and precipitous decline in recent times, which can only be reversed by appropriately draconian and fundamental measures. But I have to say, on the basis of having looked at how history has been taught in English schools since the 1900s, there never was a golden age. I wish to repeat that. There never was a golden age in which history was taught fabulously well. And whatever our problems are today, they are not on the basis of there having been a decline from a golden age in an earlier time. If, for example, we take the figures for GCSE, or if we take the figures for A-level, which are only one indication, but they are quite a good indication, then actually the numbers of people taking history at GCSE have oscillated around 190,000 to 210,000 over the last 20 years, and no particular trend can be discerned in those, and the number of people taking A-level history has actually gone up pretty well year on year since 1992. So talk of crisis, disaster, fiasco, catastrophe, a kind of historical Armageddon, is irresponsible scaremongering, based on a presumption about a golden age which simply didn't exist, and based upon a spectacular misrepresentation of how things are now. History is supposed to be about perspective and proportion, and perspective and proportion are what we need in discussing where history is in the classroom today and where it is going. All too often, individual scare stories are hyped up in the media with no effort to establish whether they're typical, whether they're representative, what context they should be set in. And since there are 40,000 schools in this country, it's perfectly possible to produce examples of almost anything. But they are no more than that. They are just examples. We also need to remember that discussion and disagreement about history teaching in schools in this country is paralleled by similar and often more acrimonious discussions and disagreements in other countries too, ranging from the United States to Russia, Germany to Japan, France to India, and Greece to Australia. And there are, I think, two things to be said about that. First, the fact that there is so much engaged, agitated, passionate discussion about history seems to me wholly healthy. And we shouldn't worry about the fact that so much discussion is going on. It's a sign, I think, of popular engagement with history, which seems to me a terrific news. But secondly, we might want to ask ourselves, why is it, seemingly of all subjects in the classroom, that history engages people and agitates people more than any other subject? I haven't seen many agitated geographers recently, although I don't quite know what an agitated geographer would look like. But one of the ways that we might think about this is that many subjects, of which perhaps geography is one, or perhaps physics is another, or perhaps geometry is another, or perhaps Spanish is another, have a kind of agreed body of knowledge which is true wherever in the world you're actually teaching. As it were, physics is probably the same in Adelaide as it is in Vancouver, and maybe the same is true of geometry, and maybe the same is true of Spanish. But what isn't the same in Adelaide and Vancouver, let alone in London, is history. Because a huge amount, perhaps too much, of the history that is taught is normally the history of the country you're in. And one of the things that excites and agitates people is that history is about who we are, what our nation is, where we've come from, and where we're going to. In a way, as it were, that geography or geometry is not. And that seems to me to be one of the reasons why there is so much fascination about history and interest in it, and that seems to me, on the whole, all to the good. The difficulty is that while I think many people are excited and agitated about history, they are often not very well informed about the subject. And if I might dare to cite as an example of that, look at a recent debate that took place in the House of Lords, allegedly on the teaching of history. Virtually all of the speeches simply recycled a set of cuttings from the newspapers from about the last 2 or 3 years, topped off with their own reminiscences of when they were in school learning history themselves. And that, I'm afraid, is what passed the debate on the teaching of history in the House of Lords, with one or two conspicuous and honourable exceptions. But it was a wholly historically uninformed debate. That's to say, there was no sense of what had been happening across the previous 100 years, no perspective on what the current problems might be. Well, of course, they couldn't have been expected to do all that well because they hadn't had a chance to read this book, which would actually have provided them with all the information they need to know. I don't want to talk at length about what the book says because I'm hoping you'll read it and the recommendations and suggestions are set out there in full. But what we tried to do in that book was indeed to provide a history of history as a taught subject in English classrooms. Not, as it were, because we don't think other subjects should have similar histories written about them. On the contrary, we're very eager to suggest that having done this for history, other people ought to write similar histories of other taught subjects. But what we were concerned to try to do in this book was to explain the extraordinary complexity of the many forces that come to bear, which explain why a particular sort of history is taught in a particular classroom at a particular time. And so the way the book is set up is that it tries to frame the issues in this way. And it tries to explain why, if we are to understand the history of the teaching of history in schools, we need to look at governments and ministers and legislation, we need to look at local authorities and inspectors of schools, we need to have a sense of the whole range and diversity of schools across time and at any given moment in this country. We need to know about the teachers of history, how they're trained, if they were trained at all, what their own sense of history was when they studied it at university. We need to know about changing pedagogic fashions and theories. We need to know about technology in the classroom and how that's changed and evolved over time. And above all, perhaps, and these are the people who are normally absent from these sort of discussions, we need to know what the teachers thought they were teaching, and we need to know what the pupils thought they were learning. The people who often tend to get excluded from these discussions, even though, of course, they ought to be at the heart of them. How many people have studied history? For what age? To what degree of sophistication? And what, if any, of the history they were taught at school do they remember? And then, in addition to that long laundry list, as it were, of variables, one needs to add examinations, syllabuses, and curricula. And what we've tried to do in this book is to follow those themes through across the period from the early 1900s, when history became a widely taught subject in English schools, to as near to the present day as it's possible to get. We've divided it up into a set of chapters, sometimes built around dates in the history of education, sometimes built more broadly around dates in the history of politics or the broader history of the nation. So that's what we've tried to do, and on the basis of this very systematic, very exhaustive research through a huge array of official documents and an oral history archive that we have ourselves created of interviews with former pupils and with former teachers, we then produce a set of conclusions and recommendations. One of the points that we've drawn out in our conclusion is that discussion and debate about the teaching of history in the classroom, by politicians, by academics, by educationalists, by pundits and by journalists, is invariably polarised in the sort of way that I suggested earlier on. Yet it's also clear from the evidence that we have collected in the classroom that most teachers would actually agree that, for example, history ought to be about both national achievement and national failings, about this country and about a wider world, about the big picture and evidential detail, about skills as well as about knowledge. There's a lot more consensus and common ground about the reality of history teaching in the classroom than the polarised public debate often leads one to suppose. We're also interested to point out, and this is another of our major observations, that across the whole period with which we have been concerned, history in English schools has never been a compulsory subject beyond the age of 14. Never, ever. And there is scarcely any other country in Europe of which the same can be said. Yet those sort of continuities about public discussion, about, in a sense, the provision, the compulsory provision of history teaching, which are remarkably unchanging across the whole of the 20th century, are accompanied, of course, by profound changes. The advent of the wireless, the television, the computer and IT have had a huge impact on the way that history is taught. The creation of a comprehensive system of education, the establishment of the national curriculum, and so on. And one of the things we've constantly tried to do in the course of the book is to strike the right balance between continuity and change. What we've also tried to do in the light of that is to try to get some perspective on what the current problems are. Not, as it were, informed by the more sensationalist and lurid journalistic accounts, but informed by the historical account that we have sought to provide. And it's fair to say that one of our conclusions, which is a resounding one, but is in some senses a resoundingly negative one, is that the big problem today is actually not the national curriculum, the content of the national curriculum. And to focus on that is, in our view, to misapprehend what most needs attending to. The national curriculum on the whole strikes a good balance between long chronological surveys and specific detail. It strikes a good balance between the history of this country and the history of the broader world beyond that ought to get appropriate attention. And it really ought to be left alone. There's a constant wish, I think, on the part of politicians and civil servants to keep tinkering with things, especially to keep tinkering with the national curriculum, but it really ought to be left alone. Partly because it should simply be left alone so teachers can get on with it, which is what they want to do, partly because it's not the real problem, and to claim that it is misrepresents what the real problem is. So what then is the real problem, insofar as it's possible to say there is only one single problem? And I'm anxious to stress, of course, that since this book is in part about the complexity of the forces that influence the teaching of history in the classroom, there probably isn't one single, simple problem which, if solved, will solve everything else. Nevertheless, since we wish to make some recommendations and believe that we had an obligation to do so, we have come up with some more positive ones. It seems to me that most of the problems that are talked about with regard to history teaching in this country today, the rushed treatment of many topics at Key Stage 3, which means that they're not gone into in detail, and, as it were, teaching does 3 weeks on the Black Death, and then 3 weeks on Hitler, and then 3 weeks on the Civil War, which leaves everybody bewildered. That problem is one that's been much talked about. The repetition of topics at Key Stage 3 and at GCSE is another subject that is much talked about, and the lack of time to give the big picture. Those are some of the subjects, the substantive issues that have been raised of late, and we are sympathetic, very sympathetic to those concerns. But what I think underlies those concerns is a matter, again, that has been commented on for as long as history has been taught in schools. That is to say that the best way to try to address these problems is not to fix the national curriculum, which doesn't need fixing, but to give more time to the teaching of history in schools, a point that has constantly been made ever since history started being taught in schools. And in the light of that, our most significant recommendation is that history should be made compulsory in all state schools until the age of 16. That would have a variety of advantages and consequences. It would make it possible to align the teaching of history in schools with the GCSE, which at the moment is simply not possible. It would reduce the likelihood of repetition of the 20th century, which at the moment is often taught at the age of 14 and again at the age of 16. It would make it possible to devise a much longer amount of time in which to teach the range and complexities of history. And interestingly enough, not only would it align us with the rest of Europe, and there are certain contexts in which that is a positive argument in my view, and not a negative one, it would also actually carry out what was the originally intended national curriculum scheme for history, which Kenneth Baker actually invented. He intended history to be a compulsory subject to the age of 16, and it was Ken Clarke who changed his mind and made it only compulsory to 14, from which decision most of the problems which the teaching of history faces today have, I am clear, arisen. So those proposals to make history compulsory to the age of 16 were right when they were made, and they ought to be implemented as soon as possible. And that is our major and most significant recommendation. Beyond that, we are concerned about the structure of exam boards and the structure of examining, where there seems to be this very close relationship between the people who devise the curriculum, the people who set the examination papers, the people who write the textbooks, and the people who mark the exams. And it is not clear whether these organisations are money-making enterprises or enterprises of academic accreditation, nor is it clear how publicly accountable they are. And we are rather of the view, since I have you with me on this, that should also be looked into. We are also very much aware, and this again I think is a point that cannot too often be reiterated, that virtually any sort of history, if taught by a good teacher, will be terrific. Virtually any sort of history, if taught by a bad teacher, will turn people off. And in the end, it all actually comes down to the quality and devotion and inspirational capacities of the teachers themselves. And it is not at all coincidence that we have dedicated this book to all teachers of history, past, present, and we hope future. A final recommendation that we have, which is a broader one, but which we happen to think is rather important, is that if governments are really serious about education, they should stop chopping and changing their Secretaries of State for Education too frequently. The average tenure of office of the Secretary of State for Education, of a Minister of Education, and of a President of the Board of Education from the 1900s to now is 2 years. And you really can't accomplish very much in 2 years. And if governments are serious about education, they ought to ensure that ministers of education are in office for longer. You wouldn't seek to run a major company, a major newspaper, a major enterprise, changing your chief executive officer every 2 years. Even vice chancellors of the University of London tend to serve for more than 2 years on the whole. It is utterly extraordinary that this most important job is a kind of revolving door. One of the Secretaries of State for Education who did indeed serve for longer and as a result made a major impact was Sir Keith Joseph. And in 1984, Sir Keith Joseph addressed the Historical Association on the subject of the teaching of history in schools, where, among other things, he too urged that it ought to be taught on a compulsory basis till the age of 16. No Secretary of State since then, I think, has made a major speech on the subject of the teaching of history in schools. We are therefore hugely delighted that Michael Gove has kindly consented today to come and do exactly that. If it's thought I need no introduction, it's even more true that Michael needs no introduction. Secretary of State, we are delighted that you are here, and we greatly look forward to hearing what you have to say.